Murder is the ultimate crime and holds an endless fascination. In this programme, we're going to look back in the files at the chilling case of Murder for Three and re-examine it with the help of a 21st century jury of experts. Psychologist and profile expert Kerry Danes, journalist and crime novelist Hilary Bonner, Jerome Lynch QC, and forensic scientist Alan Baker. What was the method? What was the motive? How was the investigation conducted? Were clues missed or deliberately ignored? Essentially, we ask, was justice done in the case of Murder for Three? In the rural Dorset of 1935, Charlotte Bryant's domestic life was unorthodox, to say the least. Under the same roof lived Charlotte, her husband, and a lover. But that year, as the winter winds began to blow, the cosy arrangement fell apart. One of the three would not live to see Christmas, and another will be charged with murder. More than 70 years on, doubts persist. In the strange case of the Dorset Three, was justice really done? Published accounts present a colourful picture of the young Charlotte Bryant. Born Charlotte McHugh in Londonderry, Northern Ireland in 1904, she was blessed with raven black hair and deep dark eyes. Apparently, while still in her teens, she was already gaining herself the wrong kind of reputation with British soldiers who were stationed in Ireland during the Troubles. Nicknamed Darkie by the troops, the girl was illiterate, poorly educated and somewhat free with her favours. In 1922, Charlotte, unwittingly or otherwise, found an escape route from a lifestyle that threatened to provoke reprisals from local Republican sympathisers. Now an extremely pretty 18-year-old, Charlotte met 25-year-old Frederick Bryant, a military policeman with the Dorset Regiment. Described as a simple country lad, he met Charlotte and fell in love. When his tour of duty ended, he returned to the farms and fields of the west of England, bringing his Irish girlfriend with him. Their circumstances changed again when the couple were married here in Wells, Somerset on October the 5th, 1922. Frederick settled back into civilian life as a farm labourer, and by 1925 he was working as a cowman on a farm at Overcompton near Yeovil. Although a tied cottage came with the job, the pay was pitifully low. One account suggests that Charlotte now began to earn some extra cash by entertaining men at the cottage while Frederick was out with the cows. Local people were apparently scandalised by the goings-on. As for Frederick, he didn't seem to mind about his wife's little part-time job. £4 a week, he told a neighbour. It's better than 30 shillings.
Well, with regards to Charlotte's prostitution, everybody was asking, why doesn't the husband mind? But why should the husband mind? He's not the person who has to have sex with strangers for money. He reaps the rewards, but with none of the costs. It wasn't prostitution for pleasure, it was prostitution probably due to just sheer desperation.
Charlotte bore Frederick 5 children, but he was not necessarily the father of all of them. Reviled within the local community for her freewheeling lifestyle, Charlotte's life became increasingly turbulent. In 1933, she met Leonard Edward Parsons, a horse trader and gypsy. It was the birth of a triangle that was to prove deadly. Parsons, who recently parted from his longtime girlfriend, was attracted to the dark-haired and flirtatious Charlotte. But Frederick saw Parsons as a companionable sort of bloke and invited him to join them in the tiny cottage. Again, it appears that the neighbourhood was scandalised as Charlotte and the lodger began an affair. Again, it seems that Frederick was willing to tolerate his wife's behaviour.
She was also Irish. She was a foreigner. as we say in these parts. And I would suspect that the prejudice against her in those days would have been every bit as great as the prejudice against black immigrants to the UK, which came en masse in the 50s. I think Charlotte would have been just as much out of place.
And indeed, this time, the husband's employers decided enough was enough. Tired of the reported loose living on farm property, the owners dismissed Frederick and ordered the trio to vacate the cottage. But it was a time when jobs for farm labourers were plentiful across the West Country, and Frederick quickly found a job here at the village of Coombe near Sherborne in Dorset. As far as the domestic arrangements were concerned, however, nothing changed. Shortly after the family moved to Coombe, Parsons again presented himself on the doorstep. The horse trader and the farm labourer appeared at first to get on well together and were seen sharing convivial pints at the local pub. But then, for some reason, Frederick Bryant became disaffected with the other man in the marriage and ordered Parsons out of the house. Charlotte didn't feel inclined to give up her lover and promptly walked out, taking 2 of the children with her. After briefly renting rooms in Dorchester, Charlotte left Parsons and returned to the family home at Coombe. Just days later, the 3 adults met together and it was agreed that Parsons should move back into the house. The strange menage continued. Then in May 1935, Frederick, who was then 39, was suddenly taken ill. Charlotte was out for the day with Parsons, but had left her husband a lunch of meat, potatoes and peas. Frederick was so violently ill that a neighbour had to give him salt water to make him sick. The next significant event was in November, when Parsons announced he was leaving, and this time it was for good. Parsons blamed the lack of work and business in that part of Dorset, but clearly his relationship with Charlotte Bryant had run its course, whether Charlotte liked it or not. For her husband Frederick, there was no respite from the episodes of severe stomach pains. He was taken ill again on December the 11th, but again he recovered. Charlotte, meanwhile, had become friendly with Lucy Ostler, a widow with 5 children who would play a central role in the tragedy that was about to envelop them all. On December the 21st, Lucy came to spend the night with the Bryants. Charlotte had apparently complained of feeling nervous and needed company. The same night, witnessed by Lucy, Frederick suffered another terrible attack. This time the stomach pains were so severe that he was admitted to the Yeatman Hospital in Sherborne. Later that day, he died in agony. Doctors demanded an immediate post-mortem. The results of an analysis by the Home Office pathologist, Dr. Gerald Roche Lynch, seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. The body was found to contain a fatal quantity of arsenic, 4.09 grains. So had Frederick been gradually poisoned over a long period?
The nature of arsenic is it tends to bind very strongly to the types of material like skin and hair, but not so to the bodily organs. It will give an indication of exposure to a particular substance, but it wouldn't indicate over a period of time. And that's the key issue in this particular case, and would have been very helpful, indeed, to either prosecution or defence, because if it had been shown that there was no exposure to arsenic over a period of time, it could have helped Mrs. Bryant's defence.
And more damning evidence soon came to light. Police descended upon the farm at Coombe and removed Charlotte and her children to a workhouse in Sturminster Newton, while they carried out a search of the house and garden and took away a number of samples. Of the 150 samples sent to the Home Office laboratory, 32 contained arsenic, including an item that was to prove central to the case. It was a burnt-out tin, originally just like this one, that had contained an arsenic-based weed killer. Officers immediately checked local chemist shops to try to establish who had bought the weed killer and when. Police soon established it had been sold in Yeovil to a woman who signed a cross in the poisons register. It was known that Charlotte Bryant was illiterate, but an X alone wasn't much for handwriting analysts to work on. At this stage, however, neither Lucy Ostler nor Charlotte had been eliminated from the inquiry. What did the police have to go on? They knew that both women had been present in the house the night that Frederick was taken ill, so they brought them for an identification lineup. The chemist identified neither of the women, but the realization that she herself was also a suspect suddenly started Lucy Ostler talking. She now told the police that she had seen a green tin which Charlotte said she wanted to dispose of, and remembered that she had seen Charlotte burning the same tin. The case against Charlotte was building, but the police had yet to find a motive. With her lover gone, what possible motive did she have for murdering the man who provided for her and her children? Had she killed him? Why was her supposed friend Lucy so keen to incriminate her? Soon it would all come into the open, for just a few days later, pretty Charlotte Bryant was charged with the capital offence of murder, for which the penalty of the law was death by hanging. The trial opened on May the 27th, 1936, at the spring sitting of the Dorset Assizes in Dorchester, before Mr. Justice McKinnon. Crowds had lined the streets to watch the traditional procession of the judiciary. Now they packed the public benches to watch Charlotte Bryant dressed stylishly in a sombre black dress under a brown cloth coat trimmed with a fur collar.
There was a huge cult of celebrity around crime at that time. Celebrity is entirely different nowadays. Television, again, I think, is at the core of this. We have Big Brother. Then they had court cases, that their villains and their heroes were not presented on television to the people. The people went to the courts to see what was going on, and crime was a major source of celebrity.
For such a high-profile case of alleged poisoning and loose living, the Solicitor General himself, Sir Terence O'Connor, led the prosecution. At the heart of the prosecution's case was the suggestion of a classic eternal triangle, where Charlotte Bryant poisoned her husband in order to be able to be with Parsons. But was there proof of their intimacy?
Mr. Parsons probably would have had legitimate access to the house, but finding, for example, his DNA in the marital bed could have been very significant, and in particularly, for example, traces of semen had been found in the bed that could have been associated with Mr. Parsons. So DNA could have helped to establish a relationship between Mrs. Bryant and Leonard Parsons.
But there was no DNA testing in 1936, so Sir Terence pressed his attack. Here, he said, was a woman with the strongest of human motives for desiring her husband's death in order that her marriage might be at an end. But Parsons had left. Had she set her course with the arsenic and thought she could get him back? But still missing from the prosecution's case was any direct evidence that Charlotte Bryant either bought or administered the arsenic to her husband. Instead, the case was driven very much by circumstantial evidence, with Charlotte's friend, widow Lucy Malvina Ostler, as the star witness.
So Lucy made quite a U-turn. She started out as Charlotte's best friend and then became the star witness for the prosecution. Now, her testimony, when you look at it in its entirety, it is actually quite damning, and it could be showing a pattern of somebody who is guilty of murder. But when you start to break down the evidence, each individual facet of it doesn't actually seem terribly strong.
Firstly, she maintained that on the night of Frederick's final fatal illness, she shared the same room with Charlotte and her husband. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, she heard Charlotte trying to coax her husband into drinking some Oxo. Lucy was unable to say whether Frederick drank any, but she heard him vomiting. Secondly, she maintained that after her husband's death, Charlotte said they will go to all the chemists to see if anything has been bought. If you can't read or write, then nothing will be found. If they can't find anything, they can't put a rope around my neck. Thirdly, she said, the prisoner had confided that the youngest of her 5 children belonged to her lover Parsons, and that she also said, "I hate Fred." Lucy also recalled that when the supposedly illiterate Charlotte read about a case of arsenic poisoning in a Sunday newspaper, she asked, "What sort of poison would you give anyone if you wanted to get rid of them?"
So Charlotte said she hated her partner. Women across the country probably say that on a regular basis. Charlotte made a comment about poisoning, but when she was reading an entirely related article in the press. Doesn't really seem too strong, and we know that Lucy didn't stand up too well under cross-examination. Now, I can tell you, as somebody who's been cross-examined as an expert many times, that it isn't a coincidence that barristers are entered somewhere in the dictionary between bankrupt and bastard, because actually it can be a very stressful experience.
Indeed, while Charlotte remained calm, Lucy Ostler broke down and wept under some fierce and intensely personal cross-examination from Defence Counsel J.D. Caswell KC. But the damage was done.
Leonard Parsons also gave evidence against Charlotte, and his evidence concerned their relationship, and he gave this in lurid details. I suspect that if the jury weren't already prejudiced enough against her as a loose woman, that would have pretty firmly put the noose around her neck.
The Home Office pathologist, Dr. Roche Lynch, told the court how his team had analysed the ashes from the boiler that Charlotte allegedly used to try to destroy the weed killer tin. The ashes contained 149 parts per million of arsenic, while normal untainted ashes contained only 45 parts per million, evidence which would later prove controversial.
The defence could have raised the question, well, yeah, but how many samples is this compared to? And if the reality is that the pathologist was talking about 3 reference samples, that's very different than if it was 300 reference samples. And certainly in today's modern world, one would expect far more reference samples to have been analysed.
The odds were heavily loaded in favour of the prosecution. Some 30 witnesses had now combined to build a picture of an adulterous, loose-living, cold, calculated murderess. Alone in the world, Charlotte Bryant was the only significant witness for the defence. Clutching a handkerchief in one hand and occasionally the witness Bible in the other, she stood up well to questions from the prosecution.
Arguably, the most significant point of the evidence that she was giving was that she was able to demonstrate that the coat that the chemist said she wore, which contained traces of arsenic, at the time she was supposed to have bought this weed killer, didn't fit her. This is your classic O.J. Simpson and the glove, isn't it? And so that should have made an impact on the jury.
On her relationship with Parsons, she told the court that when he left the house, she did not want to go with him. "I don't want Parsons," she said.
In every case of murder, the prosecution look for motive. That is the best way to persuade a jury of the guilt of the defendant. There was a real problem in this case because they didn't have any evidence of motive. You may not be able to discover what it is, but it really does help if you can find one, and they were in trouble here.
The jury had heard Charlotte Bryant give a spirited defence, but it didn't help that 2 of her children testified that they had heard her ask their elder son to dispose of some blue bottles after their father had died. A daughter told how she had seen her mother pour out the contents of a blue bottle onto a stone. The jury delivered its verdict on the 4th day of the trial, Saturday, May the 30th. It took just 1 hour for them to decide that Charlotte Bryant was guilty. The 33-year-old mother was led sobbing and quivering from the dock. In the condemned cell at Exeter, Charlotte Bryant continued to maintain her innocence. It helped her when a Professor Bone maintained that 149 parts per million of arsenic was actually on the low side for ashes and was not an unusually high amount. But the appeal court refused to hear the new evidence. The sentence stood. In desperation, Charlotte dictated a poignant letter to King Edward VIII.
Mighty King, have pity on your lowly afflicted subject. Don't let them kill me. From the brink of the cold, dark grave, I am a poor, helpless woman. I ask you not to let them kill me. I am innocent.
Behind the scenes, the MPs for Stafford Cripps applied to the Home Secretary to declare a mistrial on the grounds of the apparently flawed evidence. But on July the 14th, 1 day before the scheduled execution, Charlotte learned that the sentence would be carried out as planned. In her 6 weeks in the condemned cell, her raven hair had reportedly turned white. But was she guilty?
There is that possibility that the victim actually took the poison himself. But in reality, the finding of arsenic or the arsenic ashes potentially was of significance. But I still feel if that was the most important evidence, perhaps it was worth Mrs. Bryant being offered a possibility of a retrial. There's obviously a lot of circumstantial evidence in relation to this case and the fact the husband was ill over a period of time. But in fact, the scientific aspect of this case was minimal, but potentially very damning for Mrs. Bryant.
And were the jury swayed by the presence of a nationally known legal expert, Solicitor General Sir Terence O'Connor?
Somebody who is deemed to be an expert and very knowledgeable in their field can really sway a jury. We've seen this recently. Sally Clark was convicted of the death of her children because an expert, Sir Roy Meadows, said that this couldn't have happened by chance. They couldn't have been victims of cot death. But what we actually found was that Roy Meadows was wrong. And it also seems that possibly this evidence was wrong. And so in my summing up, I would say I don't think that any case was proven against Charlotte, apart from the fact that her lifestyle didn't match up to what people believed it should.
The next day, July the 15th at 8 a.m, Charlotte Bryant was hanged.
She was duly hanged at Exeter Crown Court. Now, I know Exeter Crown Court. I've used it as the basis of many of my novels. This is the old Crown Court, which was set within the grounds of Exeter Castle. It is such a grim and forbidding place. The setting for all the old hanging judges, Judge Jeffreys and so on. One can only imagine what Charlotte would have been feeling that morning. Personally, I think Charlotte was guilty. But one thing that's absolutely certain, I'm sure, is that she didn't get a fair trial.
In the case of murder for three, it seems that justice was indeed ill-served.